So I saw on YouTube somebody turn a beautiful bowl from just a piece of firewood. So I figured for my first lathe project, I would try this out. That way I'm not ruining some really great piece of wood. So I headed to my firewood pile, and of course, the decent large piece that I really wanted was on the very bottom. So I had to enlist some help in getting it. And here I am just trying to make sure that that stack is put back in place so it won't come down and crush me later. Using the chainsaw, I tried to shape the edges and just trim it down a little. Oh, look at that rot spot. Wasn't quite expecting that, so I'll see what I can do with that. Once I got my piece as round as I could get it, if you want to call this round, I tried to find the center so that I could attach the wood worm screw in. So I'll be using the worm screw just to attach to the chuck on the lathe. Then I brought over the chuck just to make sure that it would seat properly. And I had some of the edges where it just wasn't connecting. So here I'm using a chisel just to chip away at the wood until I get a nice snug fit. And I put the chuck back on the lathe and I'm just attaching it into the chuck. And let's give it a go. I have a few pieces that are not quite centered and it's really moving the lathe all around. So I'm taking my chisel and just notching off some of the edges and trying to get it a little more round, just so that it'll turn more properly and not wobble quite so much. Now, with a lot of work, I finally got it so that it was turning a little more smoothly. So here I'm getting into the fun part, and I'm actually really getting in there and starting to carve out that piece of wood and make it round. Now, it did take me quite a while to feel comfortable enough at this, so you can see I'm still a little nervous in different sections, and I'm probably moving a lot slower than someone normally would. And now to deal with that huge chunk of dead rotted spot and hole in the middle. And you know, I debated going back and getting another piece of wood, but since it was at the bottom of the pile, and I did so much work in getting the worm screw in and getting it all set in the chuck, I didn't want to start over. So at this point, I have my piece of wood that I took off of the lathe, and I need to fill these holes that had the bad sections in them. So I'm going to use some resin to fill that, and the only tricky part is figuring out how to close up the area and do a pour. Everything I've done before, I've been able to make a big solid form. This one I'm going to have to use tape and tape it up. I've never done that before, so I'm just going to give it a try. So I wasn't sure what to use to hold this epoxy in, so I decided to go with packaging tape as well as duct tape. And I went in a crosshatch pattern just to try to make sure that the seams were going in different directions to, again, just try to stop any leaks. And I mixed up my epoxy with some teal pigment in there just to give it a slight bit of color while also still being translucent. And then I poured in a small amount of epoxy to just give it a try and see if I had any leaks. And after about 6 hours, I came back to look at the project and, oh no, totally leaking out the seams at the bottom. So at this point, I considered scrapping the whole project, but I decided to just continue and go forward. So I let it harden up in the bottom, hoping that it would just seal up the seams on the bottom. And then I applied some caulking on all of the edges, and then I mixed another small batch of epoxy and put more in, because why not make it worse? And it ended up actually working. So I figured if the caulking worked on that time, then I might as well just seal up every single seam that I have and mix the rest. And I apparently didn't think through the fact that it was going to leak out the side. So here I am, just trying to work on the fly here, do whatever I could to keep that from being an issue. I ended up just using more duct tape and more caulking just to try to get the pour finished here. So over this next 6 hours, I just kept coming back and pouring in more epoxy as it kind of got settled, and just let it sit and harden for the whole 72 hours. And at this point I came back, I removed it from the mat, and I started removing the tape, which was actually a lot harder than I thought it was going to be. And oh geez, so apparently I forgot everything that I learned in these 3 days that I was waiting for the resin to harden. So I forgot to put the tailstock in place, and I'm holding my lathe tool so far back that it's bouncing around, and I do not have the control that I should have on it. I'm just creating an area right now on the bottom of my piece that I can use to hook into the chuck. This will allow me to turn this around and carve out the inside. I did find that the epoxy seemed to really chip out. So in order to fix this, I sped up the lathe and I took very small passes, which created these ribbons coming off of the wood and the epoxy, and that did such a nice job of cleaning up the project and making it look smooth. So I figured out the trick that using the pencil while the lathe is running seems to work a lot better. And here I'm just carving out the bottom of my vase and just giving it a nice profile, just trying to shape it to have a nicer look. Now, sanding on the lathe was so much easier than sanding any of my other projects. I just hold the sanding block in place and it does all the work for me. Now, I really should have had my dust collection a little closer because there's dust flying everywhere. And to fix just all these small holes that I had, I used some CA glue and accelerator. And then I would sand and go back and just do the process again and again until all of the holes were filled. At this point, I started to see some spalting in the wood that was just looking amazing. I never expected this in this random piece of firewood, and the hole that I thought was just going to be this awful mess ended up looking amazing with this teal epoxy showing through. So it was at this point that I decided I really needed to start spending some more quality time on this piece, because this may not just end up being a scrap, awful piece. This might be something that I really liked. And I removed the tailstock, and I'm now just going to clean up the bottom so that I have a nice flat surface to turn around and hook into the chuck. I was trying to go for just slightly concaved, but definitely not rounded out. And you can see that I'm getting a lot more comfortable with my hand placement and using the tools. So at this point, I took the piece out and turned it around and hooked it into the chuck so that I could start carving out the inside. Taking out the worm screw here. I took out the tailstock to put in a 2-inch forstner bit that I'll use just to start my carving out of the inside. This will help me to get a large section of the middle taken out, and then I can clean up the rest with other tools. This part of the process was just so therapeutic. There's something about just watching these chunks of wood come out. And that forstner bit sure made clean work of this. Oh, look at all that smoke. That is not good for my bit, so I'm going to have to make some adjustments there to make sure that doesn't happen again. And at this point now, I'm just cleaning up and trying to get it to a thickness that I want. So I'm stopping here and just measuring and deciding if I need to cut out more or just continue inside the project. Now once I got it really carved out, then I would use the forstner bit just to get a little bit deeper. I used a tape measure just to see if I was getting deep enough into the project. And now I'm back down to the same process as before, just trying to carve out the inside. And you can see that it got a little tricky as I got deeper, just trying to find a good spot to put your hand and provide the right leverage. Then I had to go back and I had to really carve out the edges on the inside just to make sure that the thickness was the same all along the inside of the bowl. Sanding the project on the inside seemed really scary to me at first, but honestly it was no big deal. Just putting my hand in and using the sandpaper. So I sanded the inside and the outside up to 2000 grit. I really liked the look of the live edge, so I used the orbital sander just to take off the bark around the edges, but tried not to change the shape too much. Then to really bring out the wood grain pattern, I used a Minwax stain in cherry. And you can see that I just put down a scrap piece of wood just so that the stain does not get on my lathe. Then I used some wipe-on poly just to give it some added protection. Once it was dry, I went over to the disc sander and I removed that bottom piece that I used for the chuck. Then I sanded the bottom and applied a coat of poly. This project turned out 100 times better than I ever expected. The spalting in the wood just gave it so much character. And I like seeing all of the rings in it where a branch had met up. And this big rotted spot that I thought was going to be awful just ended up making this piece look amazing. Here's another spot where the rings go in a different direction because there was a branch. I really like the live edge along the top. And when I put a light inside it, really brings it to life, and you can just see all of the details in this piece. This project was a complete success, and I will definitely be doing more lathe projects, so stay tuned. If you like this project, please don't forget to subscribe. And to follow me on a more daily basis, you can follow my Instagram, which I'll put a link down below in the description.